Well, welcome back to the podcast, everybody. We have a great series here that we are starting with this segment. It is kind of a mini-series on the books, the biblical books, New Testament books of Luke and Acts. And it's going to be a nice run through it. We're going to cover some really nice topics. Not get too deep, we hope, because we could spend so much time on this, but we're going to cover some things that I think will be very enlightening and I think will help in your reading of Luke and Acts. And we're doing this because we got excited right at the end of our last podcast series on parables to have Dr. Jim Mcconnell with us, and he has agreed to be part of this mini-series. So, Jim, we thank you for agreeing to do this, and welcome back.
Thank you, Steve. It's great to be back. I appreciate the invitation, and I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Yeah, me too. So Dr. Jim McConnell has an undergraduate degree in engineering from NC State University, go Wolfpack. He has a PhD from Baylor, and he is currently the professor of New Testament interpretation at Gardner-Webb University School of Divinity, where he also serves as the Associate Dean of the School of Divinity. And you said you are starting your 13th year here, is that right?
That is correct. This is the longest I've ever stayed at any job, so I guess I finally found something that stuck.
That's a credit to your perseverance and the school's patience, maybe.
Oh, more of the school's patience for sure.
One other tidbit is Dr. McConnell was my New Testament professor when I was getting my master's degree at Gardner-Webb, and did New Testament 1 with you, New Testament 2 with you, and the book of James, which was a lot of fun. Enjoyed it very much. So I appreciate you being here and the depth of knowledge and understanding you bring to biblical reading, biblical interpretation, and I'm looking forward to this series. So let's jump into it.
That sounds good to me.
Let's start, Jim, with kind of talk a little bit about your thoughts for some of the overarching themes that when someone is new to reading Luke and Acts, and I'm going to go ahead and say, and reading it slowly so that we understand what's going on. What are your thoughts on what they're looking for, some of the themes, kind of what are some baseline stuff that they can look for as they read?
Okay. First of all, I would encourage folks to actually sit down and read Luke and then Acts. Read it as you would any other. And I'm going to use the word story, and I use that word very carefully because I don't want anybody to think that Luke Acts is a made-up, fictitious story. It is not. But it is a narrative. It does have a plot. It does have characters. And the author is attempting to make a theological point. The author is trying to make a point about God. And so my fear is that we all too often read Scripture in small bite-sized chunks. We read it from the middle of the story. You would not read a novel that way.
Right.
You would not just pick out a random paragraph from the middle of a novel and read it and then put the book down. No, you would start on page 1 and you would read until you get to the end. So my counsel is that's how we should read Luke and then follow along with Acts.
Okay. So you talk about the author here, and we'll talk about authorship a little bit too, but you talk about the author here has a theological point. I'm going to use a word that I use that tends to have a negative connotation. That's not the intent, but I want to hear your thoughts on it. I think all of the books, but since we're talking about a gospel, that the evangelists who are writing the gospels have an agenda. They're not writing a gospel in essence to track the history of what is going on at the time. There is, as you say, a theological point they're writing to. How would you disagree with that?
Oh, I 100% agree with you. Yeah, the word agenda has some negative connotations, but it's a good word. The author is writing to be persuasive. And this, when we read, for example, letters of Paul, this is clear. You mentioned the letter of James. It's clear that the author is trying to encourage the audience.
Yeah.
The scholarly word is exhortation. This is what you hear when you sit in a worship service and hear somebody preach. You're hearing exhortation. You're hearing persuasion. So when you read the letters in the New Testament, that's clear. It's not any different with the narratives, with the four Gospels and with Acts. The authors of the Gospels and of Acts are trying to lead us to see something. They want to persuade us of something. My pastor in a sermon actually on Sunday mentioned the 1963 Baptist Faith and Message.
Yeah.
And in the preamble to the 63 Baptist Faith and Message, it says something, and I'm going to paraphrase, I haven't memorized it, that the Bible is a record of how God has revealed God's self throughout history. All right. Now, the 2000 has changed that,
right.
But that's a topic for another day.
Yes.
So when you read Luke and Acts, you are reading a record of how God has revealed God's self in this particular instance. Now, your original question, Steve, was, so what are the themes that I should be looking at? Well, when you read Luke Acts, there is one main theme that you cannot miss that is so easy to miss when we read this in 2021. And that is, how did this very Jewish movement get to the point where it is now welcoming Gentiles into it? Now, we hear that as 21st century Gentiles, and we say, well, duh.
Yeah.
That is not, well, duh, in the first century.
Right.
Because as we will probably explore at some point, when you open to Luke 1:1, once you get past the first four verses, you are in an extremely Jewish environment.
Hellenistic Jewish environment, is that fair?
I think you can say just Jewish environment.
Okay.
The first four verses throw in the Hellenistic part because it's very much Greco-Roman rhetoric that the author is engaging at that point. But when you get to Luke 1:5, you are in a very Jewish environment. Right? Obviously, the author is a product of Hellenistic, perhaps Judaism. It's hard to know where the author is as far as, is the author a Gentile or a Jew, or maybe somewhere in between.
Sure. Not clearly stated.
That is correct. We don't know. All we have is the text to tell us about the author. But you're in the temple, and Zechariah is offering sacrifices. He and his wife are portrayed very, very much like Abraham and Sarah. This is a very Jewish environment. Even the language, and I don't want to say this to sound snobbish or overly academic, but when you're reading the Greek text, it's very much like how the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, reads. The author is very skilled in placing us in this very Jewish environment. But when you get to Acts 28, where are you? You are in Rome.
Yeah.
So you go from this Jewish environment, this Jewish setting. You have a Jewish Messiah in Jesus, and you end up in the seat of the Greco-Roman world, the Gentile world, a non-Jewish world. So this is the main theme that you read. How did we get from a Jewish Messiah to Gentiles becoming followers of this Jewish Messiah. That's the main theme that we can't miss.
So several things come out, because I think that's great. And I'm glad you mentioned the Septuagint, because for most of us in a modern day setting, we don't have experience with the Septuagint. We don't read it, nor do we necessarily understand the background. But understanding what it means and its importance as a context for Luke, I think, begins to frame, as you're saying, that first part of the message that the author has. And if we don't talk about that, then we don't understand it, right? You've got to put yourself in that context. Luke and Acts aren't written in a modern day context. That sounds like an obvious statement, but I think we have to say it because most of us read it as if it were.
Oh, absolutely. And don't get me wrong. Luke and Acts were written for the church.
Right.
We in the 21st century are part of the church. Mm-hmm. We also are the audience for Luke and Acts. We're just not the original audience, but we are part of the audience of Luke and Acts because it was written to the church. Again, that sounds like an obvious statement, but like you say, it's something we need to remind ourselves of. So in the first century, one has to understand. Okay, let me back up. In the 21st century, we see the three great monotheistic religions. We have Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Mm-hmm. And when I illustrate this in the classroom, I do it with circles.
Okay.
All right. And those three circles don't touch each other because we see them as completely different.
Right.
Well, that's to our detriment because we have this idea, especially of Jews over here and Christians over here. In the first century, like I've already said, Luke Acts starts with Jews. Mm-hmm. And it would have been, for some Jews, inconceivable that Gentiles become part of this movement. Because Jews did not think highly of Gentiles. The typical Jewish reaction to Gentiles was they're idolaters and they're sexually immoral. Mm-hmm. So there is no way that those people could ever become part of the chosen people of God.
Right.
But that is exactly what Luke Acts is trying to tell us. Yes, God did have plans for the Gentiles to become part of the people of God. And you know what? I can prove it through relating back to the Septuagint, to what we now call the Old Testament.
All right.
It's been in the Jewish scriptures forever. Can you not see this? Is basically the author's point.
So a couple quick things on that related to Jesus, and I think one of them for me is, this sounds real basic, but I think if we start there, it gives us an understanding. So when Jesus begins his ministry, he's baptized by John the Baptist, and he heads into this 3-year ministry. He's not Jesus the Christian. That's our term. And that's a term that's developed later on. He's really Jesus, and I want you to feed back on this. He's Jesus, the Messianic Jew. And he is one more, at least initially, he is one more segment of Judaism that's added to, Sadducees, Pharisees, Zealots, Essenes, go down, and more. But then you have this Messianic movement. So it's not like, as you said, he is wholly removed from the Jewish movement. He's coming from it. He's yet another offshoot of it, I guess I would say. What do you think about that?
Oh yeah, absolutely. A couple things. You mentioned Jesus's 3-year ministry, which is very interesting because.
Correct that, please.
Yeah. Well, no. It's just if the Gospel of Luke is all you have, Jesus' ministry is probably 1 year.
Yeah, true.
And I'm not correcting you. The 3-year ministry comes from the Gospel of
John, yeah, sure.
because there are 3 Passovers that are mentioned in John's Gospel. That's a minor.
It's a good point, though. It's a good
Nobody's
point.
going to lose their salvation.
They're not, but it's a good close reading. I like
Yeah.
it. Yeah.
The other thing that I will not push back against, but you use the term Messianic Jew. That's a very modern term
It is.
for a person of Jewish heritage who has accepted Christ as Savior. I would turn that around and say that Jesus is a Jewish Messiah.
Yes, good point. Yeah, good point.
He's a Jew first, born to two pious Jews, and he is the awaited Jewish Messiah.
And he practices Jewish faith, right?
Absolutely.
Yep.
And he never checks that Jewish faith at the door. He's
Right.
always a Jew. Paul, same way. Paul never ceases being a Jew, and that comes through very clear in the book of Acts. Something that I have thought about recently, and frankly, Steve and I were talking before we started, and one of my activities this summer was moving my daughter into a new apartment in Syracuse, New York, and on her street was a Jewish synagogue. So in walking from her apartment to campus and to different places, we would pass by this synagogue, and I don't know why, and I don't know if this was the Spirit that enlightened me or if it was, like Scrooge says, a bit of bad beef or some underdone potato. It came to me that at least in my mind, and maybe I'm the last one to the party, but what we say in the 21st century is, especially from within the church, is well, how can we reach out to the Jews that they become part of the church? That's probably not the overarching story of the Bible. It's how do we get these Gentiles to be a part of the people of God?
I think that's great. And I don't think you're the last one to the party. I think there's a whole lot of people who don't even know that party exists yet. And I want you to keep on that, because assuming that the Jews get into God's plan through a new Gentile-oriented covenant assumes that the old covenant is null and void.
Okay. So thank you for opening that can of worms.
That's what we do here.
First of all, you use the word covenant, and that's the correct term. My retort to that would be, which covenant?
Exactly.
Because there's multiple covenants.
There's more than 2, 3, 4.
That's right. Okay. But early on in Luke, when we probably know the story that Zechariah doubts Gabriel, and Gabriel says, well, first of all, I just came from God. Second of all, if you want a sign, here it comes. You will be unable to speak. So later on, at the birth of John the Baptist, and it's time to name the baby, Zechariah now can speak because he shows his obedience to this guy. This kid's going to be named John. He then sings a song.
Yeah.
And in the song, he references the Abrahamic Covenant, the promises that God made to Abraham. And he basically says, now I see what you were doing. So the Abrahamic Covenant, from which Jews become a people. God looks down at Abraham, and out of God's grace says, I'm going to make a great nation out of you. That's the birth of the Jewish nation, so that all Jews can trace their lineage back to Abraham. ethnic Jews. But then God says, and I'm going to bless all the nations through you.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is what you see coming to fulfillment in Luke Acts. What God began in Abraham, God through Christ is completing. God is faithful to that covenant, that Abrahamic covenant, that all the nations will be blessed through Abraham.
Mm.
And that's something that we tend to miss.
Right.
Because we've got this dichotomy of Jew and Christian.
Right. So I'm sitting here, and this is a very practical question. It's not meant to be loaded, but it could end up being a loaded question. I'm an audience member listening to this, and I haven't fully resolved in my heart, and I'm going to say it the way that maybe people are thinking it. So how is it that the Jews get to eternity with God, Dr. McConnell? What's your answer to that? And this is a mini-series, so we can't go too far.
Well, that's a very, very difficult question to answer.
Sure.
It's a great question. And I probably will not give you a straight, direct answer because I'm still working this out in my own mind. And I probably will not come to the answer until I meet God face to face. First of all, I would say that the Jews do not become not God's people at the birth of Jesus Christ.
Mm-hmm.
God's promises to the Jews are irrevocable. God keeps God's promises. So when God makes a covenant with Abraham, God is going to keep that covenant.
Mm-hmm.
Paul, first of all, before I get to Paul, Luke Acts leaves that question open, although we hear Paul preaching to Jews in Acts.
Yep.
Paul's mission is to the Gentiles. But what we'll see when we start to discuss Acts, there's a pattern in Acts that when Paul gets to a new city, where does he go? The first place he goes is to the synagogue in that city.
Right.
That's not 100%, but it's pretty close. But what we hear Paul say in Romans chapter 11, after this long argument, 9, 10, and 11, he concludes that argument by saying, and so all Israel will be saved. My hope as a believer in Jesus Christ is that Jews are included. How that is, I haven't quite worked that out in my mind, although I will admit to being what one of my colleagues calls a hopeful universalist. And I'm influenced by some other voices that I find intriguing. But I also agree with some of those voices that say, I'm a hopeful universalist, but at the end of the day, I can't say for sure this is how things are going to be. I have to leave that up to God.
Yeah, that, as we might say, seems to be an above-the-line decision. It's divine. God understands it. That's going to have to be enough. It may or may not. For those listening who have a heavy evangelistic fervor, doesn't necessarily change what they do, right?
Correct.
You live your faith. You share your faith. The people around you who receive it, there's not really a question of who they are and what they are, because you may ask and they may say, yes, I'm a believer, and that may or may not be real sometimes in terms of what God commands. It may be real in terms of what they've been taught. So we are to live our faith every day regardless.
That is correct.
Right.
And the other thing I will say, and I apologize if we're getting a little bit far afield, but this question of Jewish-Christian relationships has taken on a whole lot more significance since World War II and the Holocaust.
Yeah.
And so we have to be extremely sensitive in how we talk about this issue.
Yeah, sure.
So we have to be sensitive to that.
Mm-hmm. So let's kind of roll that into kind of another question, and that is, can you talk a little bit about salvation in Luke and Acts? I mean, salvation is clearly a theme in Scripture. How does the author of Luke and Acts play that out? Is it any different than the other Gospels? Is it very similar? What have you seen?
Salvation in Luke and Acts is, I think, first of all, one can say for sure that it is through Jesus that there is forgiveness of sins. Mm-hmm. What's interesting, and this is not different from the other Gospels, is that Jesus offers forgiveness of sins while he's alive. Mm. The paralytic that gets lowered through the roof, mm-hmm. your sins are forgiven. Mm-hmm. The woman who comes in off the street and anoints Jesus' feet with her tears, her sins are forgiven. Mm-hmm. So it's not, forgiveness of sins is not necessarily tied to Jesus' death. It's in Matthew at the Lord's Supper scene that Jesus tells his disciples that his blood has been poured out for the forgiveness of sins. That line doesn't exist in Mark's gospel, and Luke does not have that line either. For me, it seems that the living Jesus offers forgiveness of sins. He offers healing to multiple people, and he uses the expression, go in peace, your faith has... Now here comes a Greek word that can mean either healed, rescued, or saved you. So what I see in Luke Acts is it is through Jesus that one achieves wholeness.
Right.
The word is, well, that word go in peace, the Greek word for peace, eirene, is the word that's used in the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible for shalom.
Shalom, yeah.
Which is this idea of wholeness. So it is through Jesus that we achieve wholeness. And we see a great example of this in Acts chapter 3. With, we have, the scene is Peter and John are going to the temple to pray. They're still good Jews. Mm-hmm. And outside the temple is a gentleman who has been lame from birth. And every day his friends would come and they would set him at the Beautiful Gate. And he would beg from folks heading into the temple. And if you read, it's just 10 verses, and it's so easy to just blow through this. But it's important to recognize this guy is sitting outside the temple. And when Peter and John come by, he asks them for alms, and many of us know the kids' song, "Silver and gold have I none, but what I have I give to you. In the name of Jesus Christ, stand up and walk," which the guy does. Where does he go when he's able to walk? He goes into the temple.
Yeah.
He goes from being an outsider to being included. And it's later when Peter in chapter 3 gives a speech about this, which is another pattern in Acts. When something cool happens, somebody's got to preach about it.
Somebody's got to break it down.
Yeah. He says, this man, through faith, has been made complete, has been made whole. And the word used there is the word used in the, again, in the Greek version of the Old Testament as the word for unhewn stones. They're complete, they're whole. He's been made whole. And the English translations don't do us any favors because they use the word healthy or something like this. Right. Well, there's a lot more going on here than just physical health.
Right.
He's been made complete through Christ. So what I see here in you talk about salvation in Luke Acts, you have to address the death of Jesus. What I see is Jesus' death is the sealing of perhaps this new covenant, because this is what Jesus tells the disciples. This is a new covenant in my blood. Well, that's the language that Jeremiah uses in Jeremiah 31 through 34, when God says, I will write my law on their hearts. Mm-hmm. So that Jesus' death in Luke, I think, is the sealing of this new covenant. Very similar to how Moses seals the covenant by slaying an animal and sprinkling blood on all the implements in the tabernacle and then sprinkling blood on the people. What I don't hear in Luke is Jesus takes on the sins of all of humanity and God then sacrifices him in our place. This substitutionary penal atonement, to use the academic term for that. And what I find after 12 years of teaching students is that's the paradigm that everybody wants to overlay. Well, a close reading of Luke tells us that's not necessarily what's happening. Well, and I'm being kind. I would say that's not at all what is happening in Luke. That's not the idea. So that Jesus, and don't get me wrong, it's not that Jesus doesn't take sins away. Jesus does forgive sins. That's clear in Luke Acts. But it's not through this penalty that Jesus takes the punishment that I deserve. That's not the theology that Luke is promoting through the death of Jesus.
So it sounds like part of what you're saying is, in Luke, salvation is in part about wholeness. Maybe even wholeness in the terms of, you mentioned the shalom, that total well-being concept. We say peace, but it's a deeper thing than that. It's total well-being, right? Even in the midst of crisis, tension, all those kinds of things. But maybe part of Luke's salvation theology is you are made whole again, and that wholeness is you are who you were intended to be in God's design.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yes.
And if that's the case, then salvation is forgiveness of, including the forgiveness of sins, is found in the person of Jesus Christ, because he is God made manifest, not simply or solely in the death of Jesus Christ. And that going to the cross, as it were, dying, ascending, has as much to do with obedience and covenant as it does with substitutionary atonement. Yes? No?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
So, again, what I tell students all the time is, I don't know this because I haven't done the scientific research, but if we polled Joe or Jane persons, and asked the question, is Jesus divine? Yes. Was Jesus a human? Yes. If you had to choose, which one would it be? Which is heretical.
Right.
But just for discussion's sake, if you had to choose, which would it be? I think most people would gravitate toward Jesus is God.
Yes.
Jesus is divine.
Yep.
And I think that is not to our advantage when we read Luke Acts, because, well, clearly Jesus is the risen Lord. This comes through loud and clear in Acts. But what's even clearer to me from a close reading of Luke is Jesus is the ideal human. Jesus is what all humans were created to be. And this is what we see in Jesus, because this theme of of obedience to God's plan is very strong in Luke. That Jesus is completely obedient to God's plan to the point that he is completely innocent multiple times from multiple characters in the Passion narrative in Luke. Jesus is innocent. Pilate says he's innocent. Herod implicitly says he's innocent. The thief on the cross says he's innocent. And at Jesus' death, whereas in Luke's source, Mark, the centurion at the foot of the cross said, surely this was the Son of God.
Yeah.
In Luke, he says, surely this man was innocent. Or the word is dikaios, which could be translated righteous. Jesus, despite being completely innocent, is still willing to go through God's plan of him dying on the cross. And so he shows for us what it means to be human, to be in a right relationship with God, which the word you use is obedience, which is the right word. Complete and total surrender of one's will to God's will. This is exactly what Jesus prays in the garden in Luke, when only in Luke, the blood sweat comes. So Jesus shows us what it means to be truly human in a relationship with God that is unimpeded by sinfulness. Now, I think what you have to read in Luke Acts is it's through Jesus' death and resurrection, and so often we just stop at Jesus' death and forget about the resurrection. But Luke Acts is clear. It's through Jesus' death and resurrection that we now have the opportunity to be who we truly were created to be, because it's through Jesus' death and resurrection that Jesus pours out his Spirit. Now we're at Pentecost in Acts.
Right.
And now, through the Spirit, we are enabled, and I don't want to read too much of Paul into Luke Acts, but it's hard not to. But it's through the pouring out of the Spirit, then, that we can now live in that relationship with God that God intended from the beginning for all people, that we see modeled by Jesus, his obedient Son.
Do you sense that humanity of Jesus is stronger, more prevalent in Luke than it is in the other Gospels?
I think so. I really do. And because I think that is a theme that Luke is really trying to persuade us of, that if you want to see what it means to be a human, look at Jesus.
Right.
It's interesting because in the genealogy in Luke, well, let me back up. In the genealogy in Matthew begins with Abraham and traces the genealogy of Jesus from Abraham through all these Jewish figures and a few Gentiles, including a few women, which is interesting.
Yes, he does.
To Jesus. Luke flips it around. He begins with Jesus and traces back, but he doesn't stop at Abraham. He goes back to Adam.
Right.
Which again, I think Luke is making the statement then that, yes, Jesus is a Jew. Abraham is his great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather. But even more, Jesus is one of us. Because part of his lineage is Adam.
Yeah.
Clearly that's true in Matthew, but Matthew doesn't make that point explicitly. Luke does. So that the humanity of Jesus, right there in chapter 3 with the genealogy, which probably most of us kind of just blow through and don't pay any attention.
Yeah, that's kind of boring reading during that part.
But he's making a very important theological point, that Jesus is one of us. He's a human being, and that we should therefore consider Jesus as a human being. Now, part of the, and again, no scientific research here, this is just my gut. I think most of us want to see Jesus as divine rather than human, because then I can always say, well, but he was God.
Right.
But he was God, so therefore, and I'm not. So now I have an excuse for being a sinful human. So we use that expression, well, and it's after we make a mistake. Well, I'm only human. Well, we're missing an adjective there. I'm only a sinful human. If you really want to know what it means to be human, look at Jesus in Luke's gospel. That's what humanity was intended to be.
So the life of Jesus then, in part, is a defining or redefining of humanity for Luke, for the Gospel of Luke?
I think he's portraying it. I don't think it's a redefining. I think it's a reorientation of the audience to say, this. If you want to see what it means to be human, just look at this guy. He is completely obedient to God's will and allows God to do incredible things through him. It's through Jesus in Luke that God brings shalom to all areas of life, to relationships, to humanity's relationships with nature, humanity's relationship with God. It is through Jesus that shalom is restored